Hello, all you wonderful people. Always good to know you're there. Got another brilliant interview lined up. Going to be talking about money and gold and property and inflation and income tax and all of the rest of it with the ever insightful Nick Ward of Gold Bullion Partners. We'll be exploring real issues. We'll be contemplating whether or not the banks can be trusted. I think I know the answer to that one. But before we get started, let me tell you how to support the channel. Simply go to patreon.com, find me by name, sign up. It'll cost you the price of a cup of coffee once a month, but you get early access to all my new content, and you get exclusive access to, amongst other sessions, a question and answer video where you can ask me anything. Literally, there's nothing off the table. We just run out of time, usually. Details are down there somewhere. Okay, let's get to Nick Ward. My guest is Nick Ward. He should be familiar to regulars on this channel because he's been a guest at least a couple of times before, maybe even more. I'm losing track. Nick's the CEO of Gold Bullion Partners, one of those out there who provides people with the option and the chance to acquire some solid gold and other precious metals and tuck them away wherever people tuck those precious things. Great to see you again, Nick.
Yeah, good to see you again, Neil. I know it's been quite a while. I think it's been about 6 months actually since we last spoke.
It could well be. We've spoken. I think our early conversations were about gold and the role that gold has always played in, matters financial, a mechanism by which one way or another people have been able to transact, engage with one another in trade and set aside wealth and all of the rest of it. But then I think perhaps even now it might actually be helpful, I think, to my audience to talk about some of the basics of the financial system that we all take for granted. And when I say take for granted, I mean, inevitably, the way that we transact, it's around us like water surrounds a fish. It's just there. And you're not necessarily aware of it until something goes wrong with it. Mm-hmm. As long as it's just there and it's flowing through your gills, everything's fine. But I think it might be helpful if you, with your expertise, could give us a bit of a background about the way in which and the mechanism by which cash or money is conjured into being and how it flows through us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're right about the water, and I think the system relies on people's apathy to an extent to actually not understand how that system does work. But ultimately, it's all based on debt, inflation, and taxation. And I wanted to explain the real reason those exist and why your money
all of those,
isn't
just before you start, those three words are all vaguely uncomfortable for people, really.
Yeah.
People don't really like to contemplate debt, however much debt they're in. They don't like to talk about inflation. Those concepts are always troubling. Taxations, things that people, they know they're out there, a bit like ill health and bad weather, but they don't really want to contemplate them.
Yeah, you're right. They stick their heads in the sand and they want to pretend their money is safe in the bank when it's not. And look, people are struggling with the cost of living. They are distracted by other things. There always appears to be a new tax. So I wanted to explain how that system is actually designed and why it is designed the way that it is. So, I mean, not only is this a cause I feel so strongly about, but really it's at the root of all evil. And I don't want anyone to see this as some kind of a black pill or being too depressing, as there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is a solution. But we need to move away from a parasitical, usurious banking system. And to do that, well, I think first people need to understand how fractional reserve banking works. And that will give us a foundation for these other concepts that you mentioned there. But look, firstly, to begin with, even the name fractional reserve banking in itself is very misleading. In economics, we're taught that when someone deposits money in the bank can lend out up to 10 times that amount. So to put that basically, that just means that if you deposit £1 in the bank, they can create another £9 in digital credit. And the reason it's called reserve is because banks are only required to keep about 10% of those deposits in reserve. The rest can then be lent out or used to create new money. But here's the catch. I mean, that money is mainly digital and it doesn't physically exist. It isn't there. And this is just what people do not realize. None of that money exists. It's purely digital, not physical. So if everyone suddenly wanted to take their cash out and converted their digital deposits into physical money, the bank wouldn't have enough to cover everyone's withdrawals. As the cash, it's just not there.
Banks don't really have any money, do they? In the system that we operate with, this fractional reserve banking, they don't have any money at all, really. They
No.
just if someone approaches them and says, I want to borrow £1,000, the bank just magically says, well, you owe us that £1,000 now, plus a good chunk of interest on the top of that.
Exactly
and
that.
The only real money that's ever created is whatever that person then earns by the sweat of their back or by their whatever effort. And that's money. But the bank has just put that person into debt to the amount that business or that individual seeks to spend in an effort to survive or to get ahead.
Exactly that, Neil. It's just a game of promises and digital entries, not real tangible money. Because of, I mean, here's the catch. That money is mainly digital. There's very, very few pennies and pounds. So yes, if everybody did want to take it out, well, the bank just say, well, we haven't got it. So that creates the potential for bank runs and therefore the need for a central bank, which is basically a lender of last resort that will end up with all the assets of the other distressed banks. And it also provides support to those private banks to make those reckless loans, Neil, eventually allowing them to accumulate all the assets when people finally default because of the interest that you mentioned. So, look, ultimately, this has been part of the plan all along. And I think that's how they do want it to end, with the central banks owning everything. But yes, essentially, when you deposit your money in the bank, they become the legal owner of your money. And once they own it, they can spend it as they see fit. They can do what they want with it. And that's just on issuing more loans, which are primarily secured against assets like property. And if you can't repay it, well, they'll just repossess it. And that's why a massive portion of the bank's balance sheet is mortgage lending. You'll notice with a standard 25-year loan, they're earning interest on, like you said, on someone's lifetime of work. And if you can't repay, you foreclose. And because houses aren't running off anywhere, they can't go anywhere. That's why the banks love issuing loans against them. They know they can make you homeless. So you'll do anything you can to keep your home. And that's why they hit you where it hurts. They understand that a safe place to live is something everyone longs for. And by the time you've eventually paid off that interest on the mortgage, you paid it 3 times over, 3 times its value. I don't think a lot of people realise that. But just going back to the topic.
So effectively you buy 3 houses to live in one.
Exactly, yeah, with the interest rates being where they are.
Why, if we set aside, let's say we accept that in order for economies to grow and for nations to prosper, there has to be. Let's just play devil's advocate and say that we have to accept this creation of money out of thin air. Why though doesn't that remain under the complete control of the people?
Absolutely.
Why does it go out to private businesses, which are banks, which are all the decisions there are being made by unelected, unaccountable individuals, and the legal responsibility of those banks is to benefit their shareholders and all of the rest of it in that way of businesses. Why do nation states relinquish that magical power?
Yeah, absolutely. So the other way that the banks actually spend your money is by creating digital currency. And there's been a monumental battle throughout history for this privilege. I mean, that's a whole series of podcasts in itself. We could go down a huge rabbit hole with that. But through wars, deception, assassination, the banks have been given by government the license to create money. And that's something called seigniorage. That's the technical term for it. So in fact, only 3% of money is created by the Bank of England in physical notes and coins. The other 97% has been created from those private banks that you said as debt. And this is the crux of it. When you take out a mortgage, the bank, that isn't someone else's money that sat in the bank. They create it out of thin air. And the reason this is so important, Neil, is because money is debt. From a historical perspective, you can go all the way back to the Magna Carta if you like. I mean, providing our nation with money should be the sole role of the government. But as you allude to, it's been outsourced to the banks. Now, when money is debt, it raises kind of two brutal truths about our economy. And the first is to create this illusion of growth, we have to keep taking out more debt. And because all money is someone else's debt, not only do they have to find more individuals and companies to lend to, they also have to find sovereign states as well, which is why the system you'll see has expanded into the third world. And we can see the huge inequality and poverty that's inflicting on resource-rich countries like Venezuela and other countries in Africa. But secondly, there then comes a point where people can't afford more debt and the growth stalls. And when that happens, the money, it just stops existing, Neil. The economy crashes, banks collapse, 97% of all that money, every pound and penny, it can vanish overnight. And that's why you'll see the banks are now enforcing something called a bail-in in their terms and conditions. So they can essentially just seize all your funds if they get into financial difficulty, or alternatively, they do something called a bailout. With the taxpayers' money, they socialise the losses, and that's what they did in 2008.
This that you're describing, I've been saying increasingly now, it's a realisation that I've come to, and I feel as if it's something that I was just sort of vaguely aware of anyway, but I just didn't focus on it. It's organised crime. Yep. We're persuaded as individuals that we live in rules-based societies, that everybody has to obey law equally, that what applies to that person applies equally to this person, and the consequences are all the same, and that there are things we mustn't do, like murder and steal and cause willful damage and hurt people, and so on and so on. But the powerful have no intention of abiding by any of that, to the extent that we might as well be being run by the Cray twins or the mafia or the Cosa Nostra or whatever.
I think it's worse than that, Neil.
Well, so do I, because I think that to some extent there was at least a kind of a code of honour amongst the good fellas. There was something there, whereas we're up against cold, calculated, mechanised crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If tax is theft.
Yep.
And there's more and more tax all the time. It's nudging towards the point where presumably we'll be paying 100% tax.
Absolutely. I mean, that flows quite nicely, actually. So if we can't take on any more debt and the governments are insolvent, they're then forced to increase those taxes. So taxation, you're right, it's going to carry on rising until we reach a point where it's effectively 100%. And we're in a dystopian, Orwellian world where we're begging for universal income, and you're indebted to the government for everything. But it's not the government, because then, of course, in comes those lenders of last resort, the central banks, burdening our governments with even more debt, aided by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So it's all geared to indebting us every step of the way. And Neil, today, just looking at the UK for 1 second, our banking sector have created £5.4 trillion. And to put
since
that
when? Since when?
This is since they've been going. The system has created. This is the final sum as of 2025. As of about a week ago, when I looked the statistic up, it's 5.4 trillion now. So putting that into perspective, if you convert that If you convert those pounds into seconds, 1 billion is nearly 32 years. But that 5.4 trillion is 172,800 years. It's mind-boggling. That's just the UK alone. But what people don't know about this debt, which goes back to what you were saying about private entities, the Fed, the Bank of England, they're certainly not public institutions. We don't owe that debt to, it's not a public institution. They're private entities with shareholders of some very, very prominent names, protected in the City of London, where they're completely autonomous. They've got complete autonomy. And the reality is they never, ever want us to repay that debt. They just want you to repay the interest forever. Because obviously if we do repay it off, well, the money disappears, it's gone. And then they have to find somebody else to prey on. So it's all about this cycle. They want us in perpetual debt servitude, if you like.
One of the central problems, one of the fundamental Sisyphean aspects to this is that while banks, by jiggery-pokery and sleight of hand, create money, and that people then spend and then contemplate repaying as real money with interest on the top of it.
Yeah.
But the banks don't allow into circulation the money that would satisfy the debt. So they create the principle. Person A asks for £100, and then they say yes to all those lots and lots of people each asking for £100. No, but they're expecting £150 to be paid back by each of those people. Mm-hmm. But they don't create that extra, that interest. And so, don't we exist in this dystopian situation where it's literally impossible, even if we were all to get together and say let's pay the debt? We can't, because that amount of money is not circulating.
No, I know. And this is the disgusting reality behind it. If you look at Charles Ponzi in history, he created a system where as long as new investors keep entering, you can pay the existing ones a promised return. But if you don't have the actual cash, you have to sell more and more investments to cover the payout, creating, again, this cycle of ever-increasing debt. And that's precisely what the fiat currency system is. It's a Ponzi scheme that guarantees growth of debt. And eventually it will spiral out of control and collapse. And every fiat currency in history has ended this way, Neil. 740 of them. So yes, you're right. It's nothing more than an illusion. And this is why so many people feel safe and trust the system when they shouldn't. But the next question, I suppose, then comes, well, look, if we've run out of individuals, we've run out of countries, what else can we do to keep the system alive, to just keep it going and juicing it up? How do we make more debt? Well, that then comes down to war. So World War I, World War II, Cold War, Vietnam War, War on Terror, you name it, every single war has been funded on both sides by the central banks. And you said earlier, you mentioned a cabal like the mafia. Well, it does operate that way because more debt then allows those in power to take over intelligence agencies and to create false flags. So the so-called deep state, in reality, is just the global banking system working behind the scenes to maintain dominance. And as the central banks control the entire money supply, they can manipulate every corporation, profit from endless war. They then launder money through foreign aid, using it to bribe politicians and maintain the illusion of democracy. But behind the scenes, the intelligence agencies are operating covert missions outside of parliamentary oversight while they build these networks for racketeering, blackmail, drug smuggling, human trafficking.
Because, I mean, we all consider that things like human trafficking, drug running, drug trade, arms trade, we're brainwashed into thinking that these are illegal activities. Prostitution, I don't know, all these things that you would associate with, running the numbers, all these things that the racketeers did, at the behest of mafia or other organised crime. But the intelligence agencies like MI5, MI6, CIA, NSA, whatever, they're all drug trafficking, human trafficking, gun running. You know, George Bush Senior, I believe, was known as Poppy because of the sheer volume of opium poppies that he was the growth of which he was protecting in countries like Afghanistan. And then they were flooding the United States of America with the products of that opium.
Yes.
And then circling the money back for black ops by the CIA and all of the rest of it. They called him Poppy. Not because of Grand Poppy, the opium poppy. And all you really see when you get right down to it is that if anybody else traffics drugs or guns or people,
Heaven forbid,
you're treading on their turf.
Yeah.
And they just clamp down on it. Not because it's illegal, because it's their business.
Yeah, absolutely. They want a monopoly on it. And obviously because they dominate the global banking system, they launder it through these illicit activities whilst projecting the image of peace and democracy. But basically, it's all about toppling governments and trapping nations in their dollar-driven web. So countries are obviously then forced to divert funds away from investing in their own infrastructure just to pay off these debts. And they become pawns, I suppose, manipulated into supporting US interests at the expense of their own people. So this dependency then fuels their need to buy more weapons to keep their populations in line. That's how they work. And Neil, just to put a number on this as well, there's already 250 trillion in future obligations in the US. Yes, a lot of it's social security.
What does that mean, what do you mean by future obligations?
Future obligations. So not only is it existing war debts, it's ongoing commitments to be fighting in various areas of the world. Massive, massive commitments. They're signing up for 100 years in order to guarantee munitions and supplies going to certain areas in the world. But what that means is, well, they're just renting out our future and the future of our kids to prop up a system that basically profits central banks in conflict. That's all it is. I mean, in the UK at the moment, it's £180,000 for every one of us. That's what we're in debt by. So they claim, yes, the central banks exist to manage unemployment and inflation. They're there for our stability. But the real agenda, well, as we can see, it's just so much darker.
Talk to us about inflation.
Oh, of course,
Inflation for most people is just an upsetting word. It just suggests that what a pint of milk or a loaf of bread costs today, is not representative of what it will cost next year or whatever. How is inflation inevitable, or is it just another lever?
Yeah, we have inflation, Neil, because of this need for debt. Everything always resorts back to debt. So the money printing that results as a need for that debt devalues our currency and pushes up the prices of essential goods. But you're right, yeah, why do we need it? And why do we even accept it? It's made out like it is this inevitability, you're right. But in reality, it's nothing but a nefarious hidden tax. If you want to put it into hard numbers, Neil, I think this will resonate. Let's say, for example, you earned the same wage for 60 years and just for 1 second, you never got a pay rise. Even with a tiny 2% inflation rate, you'd lose 69% of your lifetime earnings over that period. So that's 41 years of your life. 41 years. But to really understand how insidious this is, people need to grasp the importance of cumulative inflation. And because obviously it goes up and up over time. A few years ago, millions couldn't even afford to buy a house in the UK. They were choosing, you probably heard on the news, between eating and heating. Then inflation hit 10%. Suddenly that gap widened. But it's never just 3 or 5%, as the government say it is. It's 10% on prices you already couldn't afford, compounded year after year after year. So every year it's another percentage on top of the last. And to add insult to injury, they constantly change the definition of it as well to hide the true picture by taking out essentials like housing and like fuel. So your wages aren't keeping up. So it's a steady rise and a total confiscation of your wealth. But because it's silent, it's far greater and more destructive than any government levy, as people barely notice. Look, people would go crazy, Neil, if their boss said, look, I'm going to cut your salary 10% every year. But for some reason, 10% inflation in everyone's eyes is fine. So the way I'd like to visualize it is, look, your bank account's like a melting ice cube. It starts off slow and then it's all at once. And if people could see the numbers in their bank account going down every day, there would be a mass exodus. But going back to why people think that we need this, well, I think really it stems from education, Neil, and the system there. If you look at how economics is taught in university, it's a complete and utter psyop. We've got a sponsored curriculum designed to produce obedient drones who don't question the existing model. And then they pretend like we need inflation for growth. No, in actual fact, we need inflation for debt. That's what it's about. Nothing to do with growth.
Surely, what you want, what a society, what a functioning society would benefit from, would be a currency. Now, I mean, I'm just using that. I know it's a circulating security or whatever, but people know what's meant by currency. You want a currency that, rather than it being at the behest of a private company or a government to make more and more of it, thereby diluting any inherent value, you want the contrary. You want a fixed number of pounds or whatever, or euros, or call them whatever you want. Because if there's only and always a finite number of them, people will compete for them. And each one of those coins or pounds will become more inherently valuable.
Absolutely.
Because it's not constantly just being, we've only got 100 in circulation, let's have 500 in circulation, which just means that you divide the value of every one by 5. You want a fixed number so that people compete.
Exactly.
And people, and then the value of your currency can only go up.
Exactly that. And we've had that many times in history, and that's when we've seen some of the most prosperous periods. But if you have a finite amount of something, you can't leverage it to control the population. And then, of course, it makes it harder to tax as much as well. And I think that's another issue that doesn't get mentioned, which is actually a key part of this system, is taxation. And the real reason we pay it, it's not what people think. Which hopefully I think is going to change the way some people look at money. But historically, there was no need for a vast system of taxes and austerity because we didn't have a central bank. It just wasn't necessary when we were on a hard money standard, when we were on that gold standard. Back then, we didn't have to pay a collective debt. So you're paying taxes now because the government, again, it gave away that seigniorage income. So when we were on standards like that, I mean, look, seigniorage, I don't want to get too technical about it, but it's the profit governments make from printing money. So, for example, in the UK, the printing a £20 note costs just 3 pennies. The government then sell that note to the banks and generate nearly £19.97 in profit. That's seigniorage. So essentially, the more money a government creates in that particular way, the less it needs to tax its citizens. Now, this was given away with the establishment of central banks, the Fed in 1913. That coincided with the income tax. And that wasn't a coincidence, Neil. The same powerful individuals who established and owned these banks also pushed for laws requiring you to pay not only in inflation, but also in direct taxation. So it's about taking money out of the pockets of the many and putting it into the pockets of the few. That's all it's about. People believe we need them for roads, healthcare, patriotism, but we've been conditioned into accepting that narrative. It's actually just the ideology of debt servitude. That's all it is.
Because clearly the debt is now so ridiculous. Whatever. I see the figure of 35 or 36 trillion in the United States of America. That's before you get to the hundreds of trillions of derivatives and all of the rest of it. You quote a figure of 5 billion for the UK. These debts are never going to be serviced.
No.
And people sit there while, on the one hand, banks create all the money they want, all the billions they want to spend on war in Ukraine or whatever else they want to do with it. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, they tax the people.
Yeah.
When the amount of tax that they're getting from the people is never going to scratch the outside edge
exactly
of the debt.
No.
Everybody could work for nothing for the next 1,000 years and they're not going to service the debt.
Yeah.
They'll service it, but they're not going to clear it.
Exactly.
And so it's a complete... I mean, why, if they can make all the money they want, why do they charge us any income tax at all?
Exactly.
It's only punitive.
It is. We even if they taxed us at 100%, we wouldn't have enough money to pay off the debt and the interest on the debt, let alone the principal sum. But it's that ideology of debt servitude that requires the tax. It's the reason they just keep obsessing over it, is because the usurers need their pound of flesh. So it's tax upon tax upon tax. And we're a slave to the system. And because of that, there's a lot less chance of us speaking out as to this unfairness. I mean, just take capital gains tax, for example, in the UK. They debase your money and then they tax you for trying to escape it, for trying to protect yourself. So capital gains taxes are not gains at all. They're survival fees. You're giving the money to the government because they printed it. I mean, they're laughing in our faces. And you're right, at the moment, in America, it's 72% of all taxes go towards servicing interest on the debt. And they're adding, it's $1 trillion now, Neil, every 100 days. So you're right, it's already 36 trillion. But what all this taxation actually does as well is it creates even more demand for the currency. And I just use a hypothetical.
Why does it serve that function?
Yeah, just using a hypothetical example. Bear with me. I know it might sound a little bit silly, but if you have kids and you want them to do chores around the house, you could give them housework coupons. But after a few weeks, your child's going to realise that, well, these pieces of paper, they've got no value. And they stop working. They just up tools and say, no, I'm on strike. But if you then, as a parent, flipped it around and said, okay, at the end of each week, I'm going to charge you a certain amount of housework coupons. And if you don't give them to me, I'm going to ground you. By introducing a punishment, a tax, you've instantly created demand for something that has no value at all. So this is exactly what our patronising governments are doing to us. If you don't turn in a certain amount of these coupons or taxes, we'll put you in prison because we've got a monopoly on violence. So they need people to have demand for the currency because it's debt again. It always goes back to debt. And I suppose the second reason for it as well, sorry, I get so passionate about it, but it comes down to social engineering, which is really, really nefarious. So they want to use taxes, obviously, to redistribute wealth. The government, they can never give something unless they've taken it away. The government produces nothing at all. It takes from productive people and it gives to those that are consuming. That's all it does. Now, they can take from one group and give it to another, and it encourages certain activities and punishes others. So you'll see, as we know, everything now is equality, equality, equality. It's always in the news, wherever we turn, equality. The thing is, in order to promote equality, you have to treat people unequally. In order to push one group up, you have to treat another unequally. So you have to, you have to treat everybody equally, but their outcomes may be different. So this is actually about pursuing equality of outcome. Now, the relevance of this is, going back to taxation, it distorts markets and it undermines incentives. So by punishing productivity and rewarding consumption, it erodes the incentive of people to save and invest and innovate. And instead, people and governments obviously then turn back to borrowing, taking on more debt again. It's popped its head up again. So instead of actually leveling that playing field, Neil, they're they're deepening the fracture. That's what it's about.
It's like they say, if you continually rob Peter to pay Paul, you're guaranteed Paul's vote.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm going to take that deal. Yeah. It's this engine. It's a pure engineered pursuit of equality that imprisons all of us on a never-ending hamster wheel.
So you said right at the top of this, and I completely support it. You said that that there were silver linings in the cloud. There were light at the end of the tunnel. As you said, the state has a monopoly on violence. It dictates the punishments and enforces them for the legislation that it creates, and it isn't challenged. We are captive. Most people are PAYE, so they have no control over their tax because that money's taken from them before they ever see it.
Yeah.
They're taxed up the wazoo everywhere they turn. They're paying tax. What realistic hope is there for populations to get out from under the burden that's created by fractional reserve, fiat currency, punitive taxation, and inflation as an invisible tax? How do people get out from under that?
Yeah, you have to get out the system. I mean, there is a solution. If you go back to a hard money standard, you can protect yourself. Of course you can.
We can't do that as individuals, though, can we?
Well, you can. You can exit the system by buying gold and hard money assets. You're deliberately boycotting that fiat currency and you're stripping them of their power.
But you have to sell that gold. You have to sell that. You have to sell that whatever in order to transact. You have to come back into the system at some point to pay your mortgage or to buy a car or whatever.
Absolutely. But there are some countries now that are going back to a physical gold-backed system. I mean, all you've got to do is look at the BRICS. So they're going back to a 40% gold-backed currency called the unit. And this is a peaceful protest. It's a way to reclaim their freedom back from the dollar system. But this is how you fight back, by refusing to be slaves to the illusion. History proves that every fiat currency is doomed. Every single one of them is going to go to zero. And that's why we need a resetting of the system. I mean, look,
what are some of the more recent fiat currencies that have gone bust? You said 700 and odd have gone.
So many.
When would be one relatively recently then that's gone?
I mean, we're just about to see two of them. I mean, the pound has lost 99% of its value. So has the dollar. I mean, there are various currencies throughout South America, Africa. They're going down the Swanee. I mean, the average length of time for them is about 27 years. Neil, that's it.
But the pound has lasted a good deal longer than that.
Oh, it has. But within that time, it's lost over 99% of its value. So yes, because obviously they've had global hegemony at one point in time, and obviously now the states have that. That's why they've lasted longer. But the average length of time, I think, of every currency in history is about 27 years, yeah.
I hear people say to me, conspiratorially say to me all the time, that variations on the theme of it's about to come down, the bubble's about to burst, whatever, but it never does. By their nefarious means, that they have it stitched up now so that they can keep this nefarious scheme going forever. People say to me, it has to burst, the bubble has to burst, but does it?
Yeah, it does. Mathematically, it has to. On a debt-based system like this, you'll eventually get to a point where the interest is so high, people can't pay it, and then the money just kind of disappears overnight. Now, it's a confidence game. It's all just a poker game, Neil. And I think what's most important to this is actually what we are seeing with the banks in particular, so people's private banks in the UK. So, and this is why it works and why it's been working for so long. Again, it comes back to confidence. But if you leave your money in the bank, the best case scenario is you're going to lose it to inflation. Worst case scenario is the bank's going to go under before that actually does happen. So what people don't know is you're not protected or insured for that 85,000 deposit protection limit at all. The so-called deposit protection by the FSCS is meant to protect you if we end up with a Cypriot-style banking crisis like we saw in 2013. But in reality, Neil, the FSCS isn't true insurance. It's a risk assessment based on the assumption that not everybody will withdraw their money at once. So that the scheme is only designed to cover a handful of small banks, not systemic failure. Now,
I know a lot of people who operate very carefully, but by not having more than 80,000 or whatever, high 70,000 anywhere, so they've got it in this ISA or this or whatever, all apportioned, not all of their eggs in one basket. So are they labouring under the misapprehension that their various pockets of 70 odd thousand are individually safe?
Categorically, yes. A total illusion. So they're really opaque with the numbers, Neil, but from their last publication, the FSCS currently has just 1.4 billion covering that staggering 5.4 trillion in deposits. So that equates to 0.026%. Or let's say, for example, for every £100,000 that you've got sat in the bank, that's £26. You're not insured. You're essentially gambling on the likelihood that one or two banks will fail, which they know is a really, really risky bet. So that's why wealthy institutions and individuals don't keep cash in the bank. They own real assets because they understand the system's fragility. I mean, just looking at the US, the FDIC, they only cover 1.28% of insured deposits. And that's actually below their own self-imposed minimum of 1.35%. So the truth is, it's not safe. It's a calculated risk. And the house always win, Neil, every single time. If deposits were fully insured, you're right. The banks would require vast reserves to cover every penny. But by definition of fractional reserve banking, that's impossible. Because if the money actually existed, it would be in reserve with the banks. But then, of course, well, what bank account would they store it with? So it would create the issue of it would require insurance on insurance on insurance. But in reality, they don't actually even hold that amount in cash. The funds in both those schemes are backed up by treasuries. So loans to the government. That's not real cash. That's just more debt. And that's why a lot of people a lot of wealthy institutions aren't legally allowed to keep their money in the bank because they understand the system's fragility. So the real function, long story short, I could go on forever about it, Neil, but the real function of this insurance is to steadily dilute the value of the pound. Yes, it's gone down 99%. But if people will continue to keep their money in the bank under the illusion that it is safe, this is why the system hasn't collapsed yet, to answer your direct question. Because it's diluting, you're paying for that illusion with your money.
As I understand it also, it's hard for everyone to find the same escape. Because I was listening to something a week or so ago. Someone was saying, quite reasonably, people are told everyone should hold a little bit of silver. Hold a little bit of silver. It's almost like a mantra. And now you'll be able to correct me on the figures here, but the way this person explained it, they said, well, let's take a country like the United States of America with a population of 300 odd million people. Let's talk about what a little bit of silver is. Let's say 2 ounces each, 2 silver dollars, right? Mm. Everyone in America holds 2 silver dollars, 2 ounces of silver. So that's 700,000 ounces of that's 700 million ounces of silver. Mm-hmm. So that's about the amount of silver that's expected to come out of the ground this year, worldwide. Mm-hmm. And 90% of that has been pre-ordered by tech, armaments, whatever. Yeah. So with the best will in the world, if every just America, they're only 8% of the population anyway. Yep. But if they all wanted to hold 2 ounces of silver, there isn't enough silver to do that. Is that right?
It is, yeah. It is. And I know we did the podcast about silver where we spoke about all the usages for it, but if everybody in the American population did that alone, like you said, it would outstrip a year's worth of supply.
So when we talk about, we're talking, let's say we're talking collectively about how to get people out of the banking system. Mm. If everybody thought, right, I'll do it with precious metals, there isn't that.
No, there
You
isn't
know,
enough of it.
there's
No,
nothing like enough of it.
no.
And certainly, I mean, it's within people's aspirations, however meagre, to buy a silver coin, with what, £30 or something at the moment, or whatever it is, if that. But people can't buy property to secure their what meagre surplus they have, unless they were buying, a hundredth of a property. And do you see what I mean? It's how do you, it's right, and we should be thinking about how to get people out from under the yoke.
Yeah.
But supposing they all take whatever they've got surplus out of the bank, where do they? How do they make it safe?
There's only 15 years worth of gold supply left. That's it. The existing prices and known amounts that are left in the Earth's crust. We've got 15 years left. That's
And
it.
then it's all somewhere. It's all in a vault.
It's all in somebody's vault. So that's why the very richest in the world are accumulating it en masse. The central banks are doing this themselves, all the while trying to discourage the individual from taking private custody of their own metal. The thing is, with silver, to go back to the silver point there, Neil, in the UK, you get charged VAT on it. So you've got to wait for the price of it to go up 21, 22% before you're even back in the green. So I'd highly encourage taking silver, just not for delivery, unless you're quite happy to take that tax hit. So yeah, the government have made gold tax-free, but silver, that's still lagging. I don't know whether there's a more nefarious reason for that, or whether it is because obviously it's just an industrial metal, and that's the categorization of it. But yes, if people can't afford the gold, absolutely look at silver. The other issue you've got with silver, it's a lot more volatile. So for every 1% increase, gold goes up, silver will jump up 2.4, 2.5%, and vice versa. When gold's got such a proven track record, a lot of people don't like that volatility. But if they've got the luxury of holding it in the long term, yeah, it's a great idea as well.
If you can't afford gold, does buying silver, is that still a legitimate means of fossilizing your wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Add another string to your bow if you've already got a considerable amount of gold. Add some silver there too, because silver is being so highly repressed. Really, I mean, the banks that control the silver market are keeping it down as long as they possibly can. All the while, they're hoarding the physical metal itself. What is it they know that we don't? It really is. Again, it's so corrupt, Neil.
It feels all the time as if something's teetering, something huge.
Yeah.
Is teetering.
Yeah, it really does. And how long can they kick the can down the road? They're like, going back to what you asked earlier. I mean, they've even admitted it. They've even admitted we're teetering on the verge of disaster. There was a leaked FDIC meeting from 2022 that I've seen. So basically the American equivalent of our FSCS. And the bankers are all sat round a table. I don't know who leaked this, by the way, but it's fascinating. And they're caught talking about perception management, the reason this system hasn't blown up already. And they even suggest that the public don't have a professional need to know. Of course, so patronizing, how dare we be able to understand topics like this. But they even admit that it would scare the public and there would be too many unintended consequences because of where we are in the system. So they're laughing about it in this video, Neil. They're even seen laughing with each other. And the fact that the public have far more faith in the system than any of them do. So how long they can continue this Ponzi for, I don't know. But it's certainly, I think we've got a maximum of maybe 2, 3, 5 years. I don't know. It could crash tomorrow. It's anyone's guess. But the whole thing is just based on confidence. And as soon as people realize that, they don't want to be the last out on the life raft. They need to protect themselves now, get ahead of the pack, and take out your insurance policy. Because when it does go, it'll happen overnight, and you won't be able to get anything out of the bank.
It's so sobering for most people. Most people are concentrating on, most people are a paycheck or two from disaster.
Yeah.
And the supermarkets have 3 days of food, and everything's dependent on the grid. Everything's been pushed to renewables. Yeah, the whole, and most people are just shoulders to the wheel individually, trying to keep food on the table, a roof over their heads. The opportunity for most people to look up and think, right, what surplus do they have? They can't. They have nothing anyway.
Yeah.
The gold they don't have is the same as the diamonds they don't own, is the same as the second house they don't possess, is the same as the collection of classic cars they don't have, is the same as the artworks they don't hold, because they don't have any money anyway.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are going to. It's that mass of humanity that when that Ponzi scheme goes, they just don't get paid on Friday.
No,
that's it.
Exactly that. We're the only generation in history now to be worse off than the previous one because of this debasement and inflation.
So I suppose the only thing is it starts with awareness. I mean, these conversations are inherently troubling and or depressing, really, but you have to be aware. Awareness is sentence number one on page number one of the Book of Reality.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's just educating people as to exactly. I hate saying that; it's so patronising, but just making sure people are aware of how the system actually is working and is designed to work, because it's far off what many people would realise and what the news spouts out. You've got to look at the insidious, and I think because people that are capable of empathising don't think that a group of people could come together to be so evil. They can't fathom it, and this is the harsh reality of it. People think, oh, you know what? I've got to pay my taxes because it goes to the NHS and everything else. And that's because they're good people. They have empathy, but they aren't capable of seeing the real dark operators, and a small cabal and group are capable of inflicting so much pain and destruction on everybody because they do not care. They do not care about humanity. They don't care about life. All they care about is control and nihilism. They'd rather control the ashes of a world that's been burnt to nothing rather than have no control in a prosperous one. And these are the type of people that we're dealing with.
Just your insight today about that 70 odd £1,000 in an account is insured.
85
I'm sure the vast majority of people who have any kind of savings trust that.
Yeah, they do.
And have operated and have structured their portfolios, as it were, to take advantage of that.
Yeah.
And then for you to say, well, that's bogus.
Totally bogus.
I read relatively recently, it's a free PDF online, there's The Great Taking. I think it's Webb. Is it David Webb?
Yeah.
And people used to hold share certificates. So you had a security that you could notionally redeem for its value. But now it's all digitized.
Yeah.
And the big entities, their shares will go in the main to a small group of preferred investors. Yep. So everyone's sitting around one big table, thousands of people, all thinking that they've got a share on the pie. But the reality is that about 5 people at the table are going to get all the pie. And when the other vast majority of the people around the table say, well, where's my crumb? You think, you don't get that. And it's legal.
Exactly that. And it's brilliant, The Great Take. I'd highly encourage everybody to go and look at it. This also ties in to the derivatives market, The Great Taking. So
explain to people what derivative. They're a great mystery for 99% of the population. What's a derivative?
So look, no one's talking about it, but the debt is being used as all this debt, hypothetical, doesn't exist. That's being used as collateral to create derivatives. So it's bets on bets. I won't get into the technicalities too much of it. So if you want to see it, basically, it's debt on debt. So what it's over at the moment, it's over $1 quadrillion. So many times the size of the global economy, like many times over. So that's just a huge powder keg waiting to blow. And again, just to put that back into seconds, Neil, if you want to look at that in seconds,
that's millions of years.
31.7 million years, Neil. Yeah.
Billion years.
Yep. So if those bonds, if that government debt crashes, it's leveraged so highly with these derivatives that the economy will just be wiped out overnight, everything that you've worked for. So what the central banks, the Fed, what they're doing is weaponizing the currency sector in these markets in order to shift assets away from you and I, and into the hands, like you correctly said, of those who are meant to receive it. And all the while they're pretending to be your protectors. In reality, it's gaslighting of the highest degree. It's gaslighting 101, and they want us to believe that everything's fine and we need this system. In reality, we don't at all. We need to decentralize, get out the system, protect yourself as well as you can, and then hopefully when the system does crash, which I don't want it to do, by the way. Everyone seems to think that I want it to collapse. No, I don't. Far from it. But it is going to, and that's why people need to get out, protect themselves, and decentralize. Get yourself a piece of land, and just become as self-reliant as you possibly can.
Gosh, almost the only response to this sort of information is just to smile.
Yeah, you have to. Otherwise, people will get so down about it. You then got to take the white pill and see that light at the end of the tunnel and think, you know what, this is the situation. I can still protect myself. I can still get out of it. I'm going to take action, just not bury your head in the sand.
Do you know what? I often try and tell myself, I try to remind myself that everything that has ever been here is still here.
Yeah.
You know, all these things like derivatives, debt, these are man-made fictions.
Yeah.
These are just mass delusions.
Yeah.
And when you get right down to it, this little ball, this blue marble hurtling through infinity, has still got all the same stuff in it than it ever did.
Yeah.
It's all been transformed and moved, and you know, it's all still here. Everything that's real is still here. You know?
Yeah.
but what the things that terrify us are man-made delusions.
It is all man-made. I mean, gold's nature's money. For centuries, ever since the Egyptian times, it's been used as money. They take on average about 2% of it out of the ground, which always align with population growth. It really is God's nature's money. But you're right, all of this is man-made. It's all a fugazi, like they say in the films. None of it exists. But people get so wrapped up with trying to keep ahead of the Joneses and earning something that's just a pure man-made thing. It's crazy. It really is.
It's when they say that somebody like Jeff Bezos has £300 billion or whatever it is, $300 billion. Yeah, show me it, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm sure he's probably got some good gold reserves.
Show me your $300 billion, Jeff. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's nonsense.
It is. It's all a nonsense to keep the population suppressed and on the hamster wheel, unable to see what's going on and realizing, okay, you know what? I'm going to stand against the system. And if a few people do it, slowly the house of cards will just come collapsing down. It only takes a few. No, I don't think that many. And the nice thing is, Neil, the pendulum's definitely starting to shift now in the opposite direction. 2 or 3 years ago, I think a lot of people were starting to awaken and understand it. But it's really nice to see now a lot more people figuring out what's going on and realizing they're having the wool pulled over their eyes. Yeah.
That's a good note to end on. Nick, let's leave that there on the understanding that we'll pick up this conversation whenever seems appropriate.
Absolutely.
As always, Nick, thank you for your time.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, Neil. Bye.